She was the woman no one thought would survive without him, a young black wife married into a dynasty of unimaginable wealth, where power was measured in billions and arrogance ruled every room. But the moment she refused to bow to her husband's cruelty, he cast her aside, publicly, ruthlessly, like she was nothing. The world watched her shatter, but only for a moment, because while he believed she was broken, she was quietly building something he could never touch. An empire forged not from privilege, but from resilience, fire, and pain. And when her rise collided with his downfall, the world witnessed a reversal so shocking, it left his fortune in ruins and her name etched in history forever. The grand halls of the world's wealthiest families, power is often mistaken for permanence. Generations of privilege create the illusion that wealth is a fortress no one can breach. But every fortress has cracks, and sometimes it is not an enemy from the outside who breaks it apart, but the one quietly underestimated within. This story begins with a woman named Amara, born far from the marble floors and chandeliers of billionaire estates. Her life began in a modest neighborhood where ambition was the only currency she owned. She was not born into money. She was born into grit, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. Amara learned early that dreams required sacrifice, and survival demanded resilience. Her sharp mind carried her through school, winning scholarships that others said were impossible for someone from her background. She immersed herself in business studies, fascinated by the mechanics of wealth and the psychology of those who hoarded it. While her peers chased comfort, Amara chased knowledge and opportunity. It was in these years that she began shaping the steel within her, a strength no amount of luxury could soften. Fate, however, had its own plan. At a charity gala where she had been invited through her university's honors program, Amara caught the attention of Alexander Drayton, heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire spanning finance, tech, and real estate. Alexander was the archetype of untouchable wealth, charming, confident, groomed to inherit everything, and accustomed to people orbiting his presence like he was the sun itself. To him, Amara was unlike anyone he had ever met. She wasn't dazzled by his wealth, nor did she bend under the weight of his attention. To her, he was just a man, flawed and arrogant, but intriguing. What began as a whirlwind romance quickly spiraled into a marriage that stunned both the elite and the media. Tabloids branded Amara as the outsider, the girl from nothing who married into everything. For the public, she became a symbol of a fairy tale. For Alexander's family, however, she was a problem. Behind closed doors, the glittering facade was far from perfect. Alexander carried the entitlement of a man who believed money equaled control. He adored Amara when she was compliant, but his admiration soured whenever she asserted independence. His family whispered that she didn't belong, that her presence tainted their legacy. At first, Amara ignored the cruelty. She believed love was enough to bridge the divide. She told herself the whispers didn't matter, that her intelligence and determination would eventually win their respect. But the reality was far harsher. Alexander's mother made no effort to hide her disdain, often reminding Amara of her place. At dinners, her words were sharp daggers wrapped in polite smiles. "You should be grateful," she would say, as if Amara's worth began and ended with her marriage. The board members of Alexander's company dismissed her ideas during charity planning, viewing her not as a partner, but as an accessory. Even staff who worked in the estate treated her with the condescending pity reserved for those considered temporary. The true fracture came the day Amara dared to challenge Alexander's authority in public. During a high-profile fundraiser attended by politicians, celebrities, and industry moguls, Amara questioned a deal Alexander was boasting about. Her concern was rooted in ethics, pointing out the human cost of his latest venture. The room fell silent. Alexander's face burned with humiliation. In his world, appearances were everything, and his wife had shattered the illusion of his dominance in front of his peers. That night, the marriage began to unravel. What once was whispered contempt became open hostility. Alexander withdrew his affection, his words turning cold and cruel. "You will never belong here," he spat one evening, his voice dripping with venom. The man who once claimed she was his equal now sought to remind her of her place, as nothing more than a trophy he could discard at will. Then came the moment of ultimate betrayal. At a press conference meant to highlight his family's achievements, Alexander blindsided her with a shocking announcement. With cameras flashing and reporters scribbling, he declared their marriage over. No warning, no private discussion, just a public execution of her dignity. Some partnerships, he smirked, aren't meant to last. The crowd laughed nervously, while headlines the next day painted Amara as the failed wife, the woman too fragile for the billionaire's world. She was humiliated on a global stage, reduced to a cautionary tale of what happens when someone from nothing dares to enter the world of everything. For weeks, Amara disappeared from public view. Paparazzi speculated about her breakdown, while commentators dissected her marriage as if she were nothing more than a character in their theater of wealth. In reality, Amara was not broken, she was silent. And in that silence, something powerful was awakening. She replayed every insult, every moment she had been dismissed, every time she was told she didn't belong. What Alexander and his family failed to understand was that rejection was the fire that forged her resolve. The humiliation that was meant to destroy her became the very fuel that lit her path forward. Amara realized she had two choices: accept the role the world had written for her, or write her own. She chose the latter. In the months that followed, she began quietly working behind the scenes. Drawing from the knowledge she had gained in her studies and the years of observing the mechanics of Alexander's empire, Amara began laying the foundation of something new. She started small, consulting, investing modestly, and partnering with communities often ignored by the elite. Her vision was not built on greed, but on empowerment. Where Alexander's empire thrived on dominance, Amara's would thrive on resilience and innovation. Still, her journey was not without struggle. Banks hesitated to fund her. Industry leaders dismissed her ideas. Whispers of her past humiliation shadowed her every step. Yet, unlike Alexander, Amara knew how to survive without privilege. She was not paralyzed by rejection. She was propelled by it, and slowly, piece by piece, her vision began to take form. This setup of betrayal, rejection, and humiliation was only the beginning of a story that would shatter the illusion of invincible wealth. Because while Alexander believed he had destroyed her, Amara was already building an empire destined to eclipse his own. The world had mocked her fall, but soon they would bow to her rise. The headlines about Amara's humiliation faded after a few months, as they always do in a world obsessed with fleeting scandals. But what the tabloids missed was the quiet storm gathering behind the scenes. For while the world forgot about her, Amara had not forgotten about herself. She started in a small apartment, far removed from the sprawling mansion she once lived in. Gone were the marble floors, the designer gowns, the chauffeurs. Now she had nothing but a laptop, a second-hand desk, and a vision that burned brighter than any luxury ever could. Amara understood that power in Alexander's world had always been rooted in access. Access to capital, access to influence, access to legacy wealth. She didn't have those privileges, but she had something rarer: the lived experience of struggle, the understanding of overlooked markets, and the refusal to be silenced. Her first step was modest. She began offering consulting services for small businesses run by women and minorities. These were entrepreneurs often denied the same resources given freely to wealthy, connected elites. Amara taught them how to scale, how to pitch, how to negotiate with institutions that wanted them to fail. What she lacked in funding, she made up for in grit and sharp strategy. At first, the results were slow. She worked long nights, sometimes sleeping only a few hours, surviving on determination more than rest. She faced rejection after rejection. Banks turned her away, venture capitalists dismissed her, and her name carried the stigma of being the discarded wife of Alexander Drayton. But slowly, momentum began to shift. The small businesses she supported started to thrive. One bakery she helped restructure doubled its revenue in 6 months. A clothing startup run by a single mother went from barely surviving to being stocked in boutique stores across several cities. Amara's reputation grew, not in elite circles, but among everyday people who saw her not as a symbol of failure, but as proof of possibility. Meanwhile, Alexander remained oblivious. To him, Amara was a closed chapter, a past mistake best forgotten. He continued expanding his empire, launching massive projects, boasting at galas, and surrounding himself with sycophants. He occasionally saw her name mentioned in local business articles, but he dismissed them with a laugh. "She's playing at being an entrepreneur," he sneered to his friends, convinced her efforts were insignificant. But beneath his arrogance, cracks were forming. His obsession with profits made him blind to shifting markets. Where Amara invested in sustainable, community-driven growth, Alexander's ventures often ignored ethical concerns. Workers in his factories staged protests. Environmental activists targeted his projects. Regulators began sniffing around, but he brushed it all aside, too insulated by wealth to notice the ground shifting beneath his feet. Amara, on the other hand, kept building. Her consulting work soon evolved into something bigger, a network. She founded an organization dedicated to funding and mentoring marginalized entrepreneurs. At first it was just a handful of businesses, then dozens, then hundreds. She raised money not from traditional investors, but through grassroots crowdfunding campaigns and partnerships with socially conscious funds. The empire she was building was different. It wasn't about dominance, but empowerment. Her story began to attract attention. Journalists who once mocked her now framed her as a rising star in the business world. Interviews showcased her determination, her vision, her resilience. She spoke not of revenge, but of creating opportunities for those long ignored. Yet beneath her polished words there was fire. She never forgot the humiliation, the way Alexander and his family had treated her as disposable. Every success was both a victory for her mission and a quiet strike against the dynasty that had cast her aside. The turning point came when one of Alexander's own ventures began to unravel. His company had invested heavily in a flashy tech startup that promised revolutionary results but delivered only empty hype. Investors lost millions, lawsuits piled up, and Alexander's once pristine image took a hit. It was then that the media began drawing comparisons between his declining influence and Amara's unstoppable rise. At first, Alexander ignored it. But when business magazines ran headlines like, "From Cast Aside to Powerhouse, How Amara Blake Outshines Her Billionaire Ex," his anger boiled. To see her name not only redeemed but rising above his was intolerable. He dismissed her achievements publicly, claiming she was capitalizing on pity. But privately, he felt the sting of being outshone by the woman he had discarded. For Amara, this was only the beginning. She had not yet built the empire she envisioned, but she could sense momentum gathering like a tidal wave. Invitations poured in, from conferences, from investors, from world leaders interested in her approach to inclusive business. What had started as survival was now becoming legacy. Still, the path was not without resistance. The same circles that once mocked her now sought to co-opt her success. Some investors dangled millions in front of her, but only if she agreed to shift her focus away from marginalized communities and toward more profitable demographics. She refused. She knew compromise would erode the very foundation of what she was building. Her empire would not mirror Alexander's. It would outlast his precisely because it was rooted in purpose, not greed. Her defiance only added to her allure. People began to see in her something rare, a leader who refused to sell out, even when the price was tempting. And for every attempt to sabotage her, for every whisper that she was bound to fail, Amara only grew stronger. The most symbolic moment of her rising action came when she launched her own investment firm, Eterna Capital. Unlike traditional firms, its mission was explicitly to fund entrepreneurs from backgrounds like hers, those denied entry into elite circles. On the day of its launch, she stood before a crowd not of billionaires and moguls, but of everyday business owners, community leaders, and young dreamers. Cameras captured her words as she declared, "We are not here to fit into their world. We are here to build a new one." The statement went viral, striking a chord worldwide. While Alexander clung to his old guard empire, Amara positioned herself as the face of the future. Behind closed doors, Alexander seethed. The comparisons were relentless. Investors who once groveled at his feet now courted Amara. Governments invited her to advise on economic policy. She graced the covers of magazines that once celebrated him. For a man who built his identity on superiority, nothing was more humiliating than being overshadowed by the woman he had publicly discarded. As Amara's influence grew, so did her resolve. She no longer cared about Alexander's opinion, but she understood one truth: the final confrontation was inevitable. For empires do not coexist peacefully. One eventually eclipses the other, and so, as her empire expanded across industries and continents, Amara prepared, not for revenge in the petty sense, but for the moment history would write her triumph in permanent ink. The stage was set. She had risen from humiliation to power, from rejection to respect. The cracks in Alexander's empire were widening, and the world was beginning to see what she had known all along: that the strength to endure, to rebuild, and to rise cannot be destroyed by wealth or arrogance. Because empires built on greed may glitter, but empires built on resilience endure. Amara was no longer the forgotten wife. She was becoming a legend. The air was heavy with anticipation. The Global Business Summit had been billed as the most important gathering of the year, a meeting of the world's most powerful leaders, investors, and entrepreneurs. It was an event where reputations were solidified, alliances forged, and futures decided. For decades, Alexander Drayton had dominated this stage, his presence commanding headlines and his words shaping markets. But this year would be different. This year the world wasn't waiting for Alexander. They were waiting for Amara. Her rise had become impossible to ignore. In just a few years, she had gone from a cast-off wife to the architect of an empire that challenged the very foundations of global wealth. Eterna Capital had surpassed expectations, funding hundreds of businesses across dozens of countries. Unlike Alexander's ventures, her success was not marred by scandal or lawsuits. Instead, her empire was celebrated for its innovation and inclusivity. Governments praised her, communities adored her, the media idolized her. And now, for the first time, she and Alexander were scheduled to share the same stage. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, but beneath the shine, tension simmered. Reporters whispered eagerly, cameras ready to capture the reunion. Investors shifted nervously, sensing the stakes. For many, this summit was not just another event. It was the showdown between the old guard and the new. Alexander arrived first, his tailored suit immaculate, his smile polished. But those who looked closely could see the cracks. His company had been battered by lawsuits, his failed investments splashed across headlines. Once his mere presence had silenced a room. Now, the applause that greeted him was polite, not reverent. He felt it, an undercurrent of indifference where there had once been awe. Then Amara entered. The room shifted instantly. Cameras flashed like lightning. Applause thundered louder than it ever had for Alexander. She walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every ounce of respect she commanded. Dressed in a sleek black gown that exuded authority, she carried herself not as someone who had something to prove, but as someone who already belonged. Alexander's jaw tightened. For years, he had told himself her success was inflated, temporary, a product of good PR. But here, in this room, he saw the truth. She wasn't just relevant, she was the main event. The panel began, moderated by one of the most respected journalists in the world. The theme was the future of global wealth, a subject perfectly designed to highlight the clash between two opposing visions. Alexander spoke first, delivering his usual rhetoric about dominance, competition, and the inevitability of big players consolidating power. His words were smooth, but the audience's reaction was muted. They had heard it all before. Then it was Amara's turn. Her voice was calm, steady, but every word carried weight. She spoke of building wealth not as an exclusive fortress, but as a bridge. She highlighted stories of entrepreneurs once dismissed who were now thriving because someone believed in them. She pointed to the cracks in the old system, the scandals, the exploitation, the greed, and contrasted it with her vision of sustainable, inclusive growth. The audience was transfixed. This wasn't just business. This was revolution wrapped in grace. Alexander interrupted her at one point, his voice sharp with condescension. "Idealism is charming, but it doesn't build empires," he sneered, hoping to undermine her. Amara didn't flinch. She turned to him, her expression serene but her eyes ablaze. Empires built on greed crumble. Empires built on people endure. The room erupted in applause. The cameras caught Alexander's discomfort, his forced smile faltering under the weight of her words. But the true climax came when the moderator unveiled a surprise, the announcement of a historic new global partnership. Investors from across continents had pledged billions toward a collaborative fund to reshape the future of business. And the leader chosen to spearhead this initiative? Amara. The room exploded in cheers, cameras flashing furiously. Alexander's face drained of color. For the first time in his life, he was not the one chosen. The man who once declared Amara disposable was now forced to watch as she became the face of the future, while he faded into the shadows of irrelevance. It was the ultimate reversal. As the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation, Amara remained composed. She didn't gloat, didn't glance his way with arrogance. Her victory was bigger than him. This wasn't about personal revenge anymore. It was about the world seeing the truth. That the woman once humiliated, once dismissed, once discarded, had built something greater than he could ever destroy. But for Alexander, the humiliation was unbearable. Cameras captured every flicker of his expression, the twitch of his jaw, the tightness around his eyes, the way his hands gripped the armrests of his chair. His empire had already been crumbling, but this was the moment history would remember. The billionaire undone not by scandal, not by rivals, but by the woman he had underestimated. In that ballroom, with the world watching, Amara's transformation was complete. She was no longer the rejected wife. She was the leader of a global movement. The moment hung heavy, unforgettable. A climax not of violence or spectacle, but of poetic justice. The kind that sears itself into memory. The kind that audiences replay again and again. Alexander had believed wealth made him untouchable. But in the end, it was resilience, integrity, and vision, the qualities he dismissed, that proved indestructible. And as Amara stood at the center of it all, the applause raining down, one truth became undeniable. She had built an empire he could never destroy. The ovation at the summit marked the climax of Amara's journey. But the story did not end in that glittering ballroom. History rarely cements itself in a single moment. It unfolds in the ripples that spread afterward, reshaping everything they touch. For Amara, the partnership she had been chosen to lead became more than just a title. It was the crowning symbol of a new era. Within months, the Global Prosperity Initiative, under her leadership, was funding groundbreaking projects across continents. Solar grids in rural Africa, affordable housing initiatives in South America, women-led tech startups in Asia. The impact was visible, measurable, and undeniable. Where Alexander's empire had been about extraction, hers was about expansion, lifting others rather than crushing them. Her face appeared not only on the covers of business magazines, but also on the walls of schools, in murals, in documentaries celebrating resilience. She was no longer framed by her past humiliation. She was defined by her triumph. She had become more than a business leader. She was a cultural icon. Alexander, meanwhile, faced a much different trajectory. His empire had already been weakened by years of mismanagement and scandal, but after the summit, the decline accelerated. Investors began pulling out, citing a lack of confidence. Board members resigned. Projects collapsed under public scrutiny. For decades, his family name had been a symbol of invincibility. Now, it was a cautionary tale whispered in corporate circles. The Drayton decline. Reporters hounded him, drawing constant comparisons to Amara's meteoric rise. Every headline seemed to sharpen the sting. Discarded wife now leads global change. From billionaire heir to outpaced rival. The empire that couldn't compete with resilience. The more he tried to dismiss her, the worse it became. His bitterness showed in interviews, where he lashed out at idealistic nonsense and unsustainable projects. But the world no longer listened. To them, he was yesterday's story. To them, the future had a new face. And it was Amara's. For Amara, though, revenge was never the end point. The summit was a victory, yes, but her purpose had grown beyond proving Alexander wrong. What mattered now were the people who looked at her and saw possibility. She received letters from young women in villages who had started businesses because of her story. She met entrepreneurs who said they had almost given up until they heard her name. She stood in classrooms where children spoke of becoming the next Amara, not the next billionaire. And yet, she never forgot where it had begun. The humiliation, the rejection, the night she sat in silence, feeling the world laugh at her pain. Those memories remained not as wounds, but as reminders. They were the fire that kept her grounded. In interviews, she rarely spoke of Alexander. When asked, she would smile softly and say, "He played his role in my story." But the story was never about him. It was about what I chose to build after. That choice, to rise instead of break, became the lesson people carried with them. The impact rippled far beyond her own empire. Other industries began shifting, inspired or pressured by her example. Companies that once ignored diversity scrambled to change. Investors who once scoffed at socially conscious ventures now sought them out. Governments began inviting her to shape policies for equitable growth. It was as though her triumph had forced the world to reconsider what power could look like. As for Alexander, his downfall reached a tragic irony. The very people who once worshipped him abandoned him in his decline. Friends vanished. Business partners turned cold. Even his own family began distancing themselves, desperate to salvage their reputations. Alone in his mansion, he was surrounded not by admirers but by silence. Wealth, it turned out, was no shield against irrelevance. The final blow came when one of his flagship companies declared bankruptcy. News outlets broadcast images of laid-off workers, angry protests, and shareholders demanding accountability. His name, once synonymous with dominance, was now linked to failure. And through it all, Amara's empire grew stronger, her initiatives flourishing in areas his had neglected. 1 year after the summit, a global conference honored Amara with the Humanitarian Business Leader of the Decade Award. The ceremony was broadcast worldwide. As she stood on stage, holding the award, her words echoed across continents. "I was once told I didn't belong, that I was disposable, that my voice didn't matter. But today, I stand here not because I was accepted into their world, but because I built my own. And let this be a reminder. No one has the right to define your worth but you. Empires built on arrogance may rise quickly, but they fall just as fast. Empires built on resilience endure." The audience rose in thunderous applause, many with tears in their eyes. It was more than a speech. It was a manifesto for every person who had been underestimated, overlooked, or cast aside. Her words traveled further than she ever imagined. They were quoted in schools, in boardrooms, in parliaments. They were printed on posters, shared across social media, etched into the hearts of millions. Amara was no longer just a woman with an empire. She was a symbol of hope. And what of the man who had once humiliated her? Alexander watched the broadcast from the solitude of his estate. His face was hardened, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He had lost. Not just wealth, not just influence, but the very legacy he thought was his birthright. In the story of history, he would be a footnote. She would be the headline. For Amara, the greatest triumph was not his downfall, but her rise. She no longer needed to prove anything to him. His opinion, his arrogance, his cruelty, all of it had dissolved into irrelevance. What mattered now was the empire she had built, the lives it changed, and the message it carried. That rejection can be the beginning, not the end. Years later, when biographers wrote of her journey, they framed it not as a tale of revenge, but as a story of transformation. A woman stripped of dignity who chose to rise not out of spite but out of vision. A woman who proved that sometimes the greatest empire is not inherited but created, stone by stone, with resilience as its foundation. The story closed not with bitterness, but with triumph. Because in the end, Amara did not destroy Alexander, he destroyed himself. All she did was rise high enough for the world to see the truth. And the truth was this. She had been rejected by a billionaire husband. She had been humiliated, mocked, and dismissed. But she had built an empire, one he could never destroy.